30 years ago, China was written off by Western economists as a sleeping giant. Too rigid, too centralized, too late to the global stage. But in one generation, that narrative has flipped. Powered by a unique model of socialism with Chinese characteristics, the People's Republic has not only closed the economic gap with the West, it's redefined what global leadership looks like. While American and British policymakers clung to trickle-down economics, deregulation, and free market absolutism, China's state-guarded strategy unleashed historic infrastructure development, technological leapfrogging, and poverty eradication at a scale never seen before. And as Wall Street CEOs chased short-term profits and UK austerity programs hollowed out communities, China was building the world's largest high-speed rail network, lifting 800 million people out of poverty and producing more engineers than the US and UK combined. This is the story of how Chinese socialism didn't just compete, it embarrassed the very capitalist models that once mocked it, and it may force the West to reconsider everything it thought it knew about economic power. The best part is we'll be guiding you through all 6 chapters of this production, where we'll be dissecting all 3 decades in detail. Think industrialization, offshoring deficits, dot-com bubble, housing crisis, austerity, tax cuts, Belt and Road, pandemic, and the AI boom. So get comfortable, you're about to find out how China beat the West at its own game in just 30 years. Produced by GP, the intersection where power defines policy and capital drives outcomes. Thank you for your time. In the early 1990s, the Cold War ended, not with a bang, but with a cheer from the capitalist West. The collapse of the Soviet Union was seen as the final proof. Market liberalism had won, and history itself was over. Washington exported its model of democracy, deregulation, and free market triumphalism around the globe. London embraced a similar gospel of privatization and financialization. As Western capitalists patted themselves on the back, they barely noticed the quiet reforms unfolding thousands of miles away in Beijing. China's leadership was transitioning from the political theorist, revolutionary, and paramount leader Deng Xiaoping's informal, powerful oversight to the formal leadership of Jiang Zemin, who became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1989 and President of China in 1993. Despite Deng being officially retired on paper at this point, he remained the paramount leader and continued guiding the nation's economic reforms. He promoted and pushed the 1992 Southern Tour, which reignited the country's market reforms after the stagnation caused by the student-led 1989 Tiananmen crackdown protests on reforms passed in the 80s that disadvantaged many but benefited some. The 1992 Southern Tour institutionalized many policies emphasizing modernization, state-owned entity reforms, and more notably, export-driven growth. Grasp the large, let go of the small became the order. 100 central state-owned entities in strategic sectors such as banking, energy, steel, and telecoms were restructured. Smaller SOEs were privatized, merged, or shut down. Corporate governance structures, so boards, managers, etc., were brought in. A legislation surrounding hard budget constraints was introduced to ensure accountability, as there were no more guaranteed bailouts for underperformance. Infrastructure-led growth investments in highways, railways, and ports absorbed surplus rural labor for industrial expansion and trade. The substantial pivot to export-oriented growth encouraged foreign direct investment through tax breaks and land grants in special economic zones like Shenzhen and Shanghai. This allowed previously barred, wholly foreign-owned enterprises, promoted labor-intensive manufacturing like textiles and electronics, thus creating a cheap but skilled export workforce that gave China an edge over global competitors. Central planning was kept for essential sectors such as banking, energy, and agriculture, whilst allowing market pricing in other sectors. Avoiding shock therapy that destroyed the Soviet economy was ingrained in everybody's heads by gradually liberalizing prices, carefully opening markets and steering away from sudden mass privatization. 3 of the big 4 restructured state-owned banks during this period were pushed to operate more commercially by establishing stock markets in Shanghai in 1990 and Shenzhen in 1991 to raise capital for restructured SOEs and begin forming a socialist capital market. Diplomatic and trade realignment initiatives were promoted highly. Normalizing relations with the United States and Europe was seen as means to attract investment and technology. This grew to be more substantial with the introduction of regulation and facilitation of intercontinental trade through the formation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. China bid hard to negotiate a cession, as many of the nations viewed the country as likely bringing Soviet-style expansionism to the table. Fortunately, China had been displaying a peaceful rise rhetoric throughout a significant portion of the 90s, which worked in their favor as it successfully secured a cession in 2001, marking its global economic debut. Embracing ideological flexibility under Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, socialism was redefined as socialism with Chinese characteristics, emphasizing development as the hard truth over ideological purity. Entering the early 2000s, the implementation of Theory of Three Represents doctrine allowed capitalists and entrepreneurs to join the Communist Party, a daring ideological shift. The Chinese 1991 to 2001 decade was marred with rapid adaptation, maintaining party control, and reforming state-owned entities. The nation experienced a fast-paced and sustained GDP growth, averaging approximately 10% annually. This economy surged as China expanded foreign direct investment inflows, liberalized trade policies, and grew its export-led manufacturing base. Key sectors such as infrastructure, construction, and industry boomed, driven by attracting investment and private enterprise. This allowed the nation to industrialize quickly, whilst avoiding Soviet collapse by not liberalizing politically and reforming gradually. In 2001, China's economy had grown more than 7.3%, cementing its position as a rising global economic power. The same growth couldn't be said 10,000 kilometers across the Pacific Ocean. The United States had shared a sentiment that the Chinese hybrid economic model was impossible to construct just a decade ago. As they say never. The United States had seismic economic issues of their own entering 2001 due to policies introduced since 1993. The then President George W. Bush, from 2001 to 2009, and his administration not only inherited the side effects of the previous Clinton administration's financial sector, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. I will tell you what that is in the upcoming financial crisis chapter. Headed into the new millennium, the US was also going through a recession after the burst of the year 2000 dot-com bubble and the aftermath of the 2001 9/11 attacks. The dot-com bubble was created by investors excessively funding speculated tech startups and unviable internet-based companies during the rise of the World Wide Web, in hopes for this revolutionizing the economy overnight. These were backed by low-interest loans, unrealistic valuations, with improbable expectations. The bubble burst in 2000 when they realized these companies were unprofitable. This caused a sharp decline in tech stock prices, widespread bankruptcies, and the loss of trillions in market value. In the prelude of this crisis in 1993, NCSA web browser had been birthed and released. This web browser was instrumental in popularizing the World Wide Web and the general internet during the 1990s by integrating multimedia such as text and graphics. Subsequent web browsers became public. Internet use, connectivity, and computer education increased. Statistically, between 1990 and 1997, United States household computer ownership percentages increased from 15% to 35%. This influenced the creation of what was to be called the Information Age, an economy based on information technology and the upcoming rise in newly founded tech companies. An interesting time indeed. Interest rates were also declining, which increased the availability of capital. The Clinton administration concurrently introduced the Taxpayer Relief Act of 1997, which lowered the top marginal capital gains tax in the United States. That, and the decreasing interest rates proved critical in people willing to take on more speculative investments. It's even been alleged that this gentleman, Alan Greenspan, the then chair of the Federal Reserve, fueled investments in the stock market by putting a positive spin on stock valuations. Many investors flooded in, yearning to fund any dot-com company. Venture capital was quite easy to raise. Investment banks perceived this and most investments in technology as the big bet, thus profiting significantly from initial public offerings, almost all of which were on Nasdaq. Now combine rapidly increasing stock prices in the quaternary sector of the economy with confidence that the companies would turn future profits, created an environment where many investors often overlooked traditional metrics like price-earnings ratio to rather base it on technological advancements, in turn creating a stock market bubble that later burst. This wasn't the only error the United States was dealing with from the 90s entering the new millennium. See, whilst the Chinese were industrializing heavily to become the world's go-to source for manufacturing, the United States was going the opposite direction. This administration also notably signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA in 1994, which firstly aimed to remove tariffs as well as rid of trade barriers on goods and services traded between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Secondly, this act promoted cross-border investments. Thirdly, improved competitiveness of North American industries on a global scale. This act instead granted and incentivized US companies to relocate production to lower-cost countries like Mexico without penalty. I'm emphasizing on lower costs because Mexican labor and labor protections were significantly cheaper and weaker. The North American Free Trade Agreement included investor-state dispute settlement provisions. This gave firms more confidence to invest in foreign facilities without fear of nationalism or policy changes. To give you an example, companies were manufacturing products in Mexico and exporting them back into the US tax-free. This allowed the listed countries to maintain access to the United States market, while simultaneously cutting production costs. A ton of US manufacturing industries were impacted negatively. Textiles, apparel, automotive, electronics, appliances, furniture, you name it. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that over 700,000 United States jobs, mostly in manufacturing, were lost as a result of the Free Trade Agreement. Thousands of factories nationwide were shut down. Even if they weren't closed down, the remaining factories employed cheaper foreign labor as opposed to US citizens. Most had to face lower wages to compete. Industrial communities primarily in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania faced declining local economies, population loss, and strained public services. This North American Free Trade Agreement, along with Congress passing permanent normal trade relations with China in the year 2000, locked in low tariffs and made China a stable destination for US companies to outsource production to. When China joined the earlier mentioned World Trade Organization, legalizing the nation's access to global markets, this assured US companies that they could invest and produce in China with fewer restrictions, lower tariffs, and greater market access. To wrap up the Clinton administration, his government left office with the country in a stronger fiscal health state, and when he came in, the US was experiencing its longest peacetime economic expansion, with GDP growth averaging 3.9% annually, unemployment falling down from 7.3% to 5.2% on average. The inflation rate averaged 2.6%, poverty rate decreased from 14.5% down to averaging 13.3%, and real disposable income per capita increased 2.3% on average annually. The country has also unfortunately been forced to deal with social and political consequences too, due to financial and economic administrative acts that did benefit the US, but also laid the groundwork for issues the country still has to combat 2 to 3 decades later. The US's British cousin couldn't have made costly decisions worse than this, right? It depends on how you choose to look at it, though largely the United Kingdom followed a similar strategy as the US. Between the decade of the early 90s and early 2000s, largely under Prime Minister John Major and then Tony Blair from 1997, the UK was in a hard-hitting recession after the 1992 sterling crisis, or Black Wednesday, when the UK government was forced to withdraw sterling from the first European exchange rate mechanism, following a failed attempt to keep its exchange rate above the lower limit required for European exchange rate mechanism participation. This destroyed the pound's credibility short term. The nation largely began embracing globalization, as well as focusing on services, finance, and outsourcing their manufacturing, inadvertently giving China a substantial advantage in innovation, manufacturing, and global trade. The strategy of transitioning from a manufacturing economy to a service-based economy with focuses on finance, real estate, and technology actually began with Margaret Thatcher in the 80s period, and then accelerated under John Major in the 90s period. Reliance on imports and offshoring to China became the norm, just like the US. Key economic industries such as steel, coal, and railways were privatized or downsized, with no national industrial policy pursued to rebuild or modernize manufacturing. This was the UK's self-reliance detriment, as there were fewer tools to compete with China's state-driven industrial strategy. During this period, the United Kingdom handed Hong Kong back to China through a formal transfer of sovereignty, following the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration. This treaty, signed by both governments, outlined that the UK would return the territory, including the new territories which had been leased for 99 years in 1898, while China promised to maintain Hong Kong's capitalist system, legal structure, and civil liberties under the principle of one country, two systems for 50 years. China regained control over Hong Kong after more than 150 years of British colonial rule. This increased China's legitimacy and access to capital markets, infrastructure, and global financial talent, symbolizing strategic economic impact. China used this to build up capacity in, textiles, electronics, steel, and later tech, whilst the UK, instead of taking pages from Germany or Japan's book, decided to underinvest in research and development, advanced manufacturing, and technical education during this period. Liberalized trade and allegiance with the US and EU policies was part of the globalization strategy. The UK government even went as far as backing China when it came time to bid to join the World Trade Organization, labeling it as liberalization that sought to benefit UK consumers and companies. The government wasn't considering the fact that it needed to incorporate a serious strategy to safeguard critical industries. This led to the competitive shock in the years that followed. London's focus on rising to become a global finance hub came at the expense of balanced regional industrial development. Successive governments just saw the capital as the engine of growth. So in summary, the UK prioritized finance, privatization, and light regulation, betting on service-led growth, thus causing an outsourced reliance and deindustrialized nation. The numbers for this period weren't all that bad. GDP growth averaged 2.2% per year, unemployment averaged 8% across the decade, inflation peaked at 9.5% during the sterling crisis, but averaged 3 to 4% per year throughout the decade. The poverty rate is estimated to have been gliding around 22 to 24%. Real disposable income per capita grew by 20.7%, with a 2.2% annual growth. So despite steady GDP and income growth, unemployment remained elevated and poverty affected around 1 in 4 people. Income gains were moderately positive, but broad economic benefits often didn't reach the bottom 1/3 of households. As the US flooded capital into speculative tech stocks and the UK sold off its railroads and utilities, China was building cities, roads, factories, and a new future. The Western world was celebrating globalization. China was preparing to master it. In 2008, the fault lines of capitalism split open. The US housing market collapsed. Global banks folded. Western economies spiraled into chaos. In London and New York, bailouts saved banks, but not the people. Unemployment surged. Austerity hit. Trust in the capitalist system began to erode. But in Beijing, there wasn't a collapse. There was acceleration. While the West argued over who was too big to fail, China launched a $586 billion stimulus plan, twice as large as the US's relative to GDP. But unlike the West, China didn't funnel funds into broken banks. It built bridges, power grids, highways, industrial clusters, new cities, and ports, creating jobs and demand from the ground up. Joining the World Trade Organization in this decade allowed for leverage to expand exports exponentially. Foreign direct investment in cheap labor, infrastructure, and state incentives went through the roof. This encouraged domestic innovation and the copying of foreign intellectual property that countries like the US failed to protect. Despite the US accusing China of currency manipulation, the US didn't take strong action, so China continued to maintain its undervalued currency, causing huge trade surpluses and accumulating trillions in US dollar reserves. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, technical skills, and education were encouraged to have an equipped labor en masse. The Chinese avoided military conflicts, rather choosing to focus on economic diplomacy, Africa trade channels, integration into the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a regional grouping of 10 states, aiming to promote economic and security cooperation amongst its 10 members. This granted China to launch Go West strategy, building inland zones and a state-guarded capitalism model. This was socialism in action, state-led capital allocation, full employment goals, and long-term strategic investment, not short-term profit. What actually transpired in the West that caused chaos, resulting in the nations falling behind in key sectors compared to China? We're going to have to go back to 2001 again for a moment, when the United States welcomed a new president, George W. Bush. When he came in, one of the earliest challenges he was dealt with was his predecessor, Bill Clinton, and his administration's Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999 that I mentioned earlier. The reason why this act was signed into law in the first place was to repeal another act called the Glass-Steagall Legislation Act of 1933, which separated commercial and investment banking. To summarize and give you an understanding, this 1933 legislation prevented commercial banks from speculative risk-taking to avoid a financial crisis experienced during the Great Depression. Banks had been limited to earning 10% of their income from investments. This regulation was frowned upon for quite a while. Criticism rose, eventually leading to President Bill Clinton introducing the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999. This Act of 1999 granted commercial banks, investment banks, and insurance companies to consolidate to operate under one corporate umbrella. This thus caused financial deregulation that in turn created and grew a too-big-to-fail structure for financial institutions. Major conglomerates like Citigroup were birthed, hybrids that combined multiple financial services. This led to banks like this using deposits meant for safekeeping to fund speculative investments such as mortgage-backed securities. This increased exposure to risky financial instruments. These massive combined financial institutions over time became deeply interconnected with the global markets, so in the event of a failure of one institution, could cause a domino effect throughout the economy, which brings me to the global financial crisis that happened in 2008. Let me start with the prelude to this crisis. Through the launching of the American Dream Down Payment Act of 2003, President George W. Bush's way of getting more people owning their own home. In his own words, it's an essential part of the American dream. This assisted low-income, first-time homebuyers cover down payments and closing costs. The features provided $200 million in federal funds annually to help families afford a home down payment. This targeted households earning less than 80% of their area's median income and was part of President Bush's broader plan to add 5.5 million new minority homeowners by 2010. This was the best time to do this as interest rates were historically low since the dot-com bubble burst. This act coincided and to an extent enabled what was to be the subprime mortgage crisis, which began in early 2007 due to loose lending standards, zero down payment, adjustable rate mortgages, and subprime loans issued to high-risk borrowers. The subprime mortgage crisis was a result of financial incentives like subprime lending. These were provision loans to people in the United States who may have had difficulty maintaining their repayment schedule of the home loans. These provision loans had higher interest rates, poor quality collateral, and less favorable terms in order to compensate for higher credit risk. During this period, many subprime loans were packaged into mortgage-backed securities, a kind of asset security that is backed by a mortgage, or in this case, a mortgage loan used to purchase or maintain a home, plot of land, or other real estate. The borrowers agreed to pay the lender over time, normally in a series of regular payments divided into principal and interest. The property then served as collateral to secure the loans. Now, many of the people who went and applied for these mortgages, as mentioned earlier, had poor credit. Nonetheless, who doesn't need or want a house? Especially in this case, where the US government created a structure for you to still be able to qualify. Financial institutions chose to exploit the government home ownership agenda with excessive house value speculation and predatory lending by packaging risky mortgages into mortgage-backed securities tied to US real estate and the vast web of derivatives linked to those mortgage-backed securities, with little to no regulation. This created a housing bubble that inflated rapidly from 2004 to 2007. So basically, people were defaulting on their mortgages, house values diminished, mortgage-backed securities began collapsing in value too, along with hedge funds. Banks began warning that people might not be able to withdraw from certain funds. Most went as far as seeking emergency funding, which resulted in a liquidity crisis that spread to global institutions. This peaked when Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy in 2008, triggering a stock market crash and bank runs in several countries. This only exacerbated the global recession that was happening since 2007. With the S&P 500 losing 50% of its value until 2009, people lost their jobs, their life savings, their homes, or even worse, all three. Now we're back to my point earlier. The system of having massive financial institutions creates a sort of moral hazard, where the larger the institutions became, the more they were seen as too big to fail. These institutions would thus expect government bailouts if they faced trouble, or even worse, collapsed. This is what in part enabled US financial institutions to practice the excessive risk-taking in the first place. In addition to this crisis, the country had continued following its practice from the 90s by offshoring production to China, cutting an estimated 3.4 million jobs in the process. This is in part evidence with the finance-focused reforms I just told you about that were introduced during this decade between 2001 and 2011. How could I not have mentioned the Bush tax cuts introduced and packaged through acts such as the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001, as well as the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003. Despite bringing hope by encouraging consumer spending, business investment, and job creation, they also disproportionately benefited the wealthy, with the lower to middle income earners receiving smaller relative and absolute benefits. According to the Brookings Institution, a dynamic distributional analysis indicated that while the tax cuts initially appeared to benefit most households, once financing methods and behavioral responses were considered, the majority of households were worse off. There's several findings from independent analysis firms such as the Congressional Budget Office and the Tax Policy Center that support this. The tax cuts added to immense budget deficits and lowered the government's ability to invest in social programs. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the Bush tax cuts contributed approximately $1.6 trillion to the national debt between 2001 and 2011. This excludes interest payments. This substantial depletion in federal revenue played a lead role in transforming projected budget surpluses into deficits during that period. These resources could have been allocated to areas such as Social Security, Medicare, education, and infrastructure, but were limited due to the reduced revenue base. To close off this administration, President George W. Bush left the American people in a significantly worse financial and economic position at the end of his presidency in 2009 than when he entered office in 2001. While he did inherit a mild recession from the dot-com bubble burst, the economy was still running budget surpluses, unemployment was low, and public debt was manageable. Over the course of his administration, a combination of large tax cuts as well as increased military spending on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan worsened this. GDP growth was 1.8%, the unemployment rate averaged 5.3%, peaking at 7.2%. This is the only administration with a 0.0% inflation. The poverty rate was 13.2%, and lastly, the real disposable income per capita was between $36,000 and $40,000. Throughout this decade, the US continued enabling China's rise without safeguarding itself, a trend that would cause political and economic backlash in the following decade. The US wasn't alone again, of course. The UK followed suit under both Prime Minister Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. These governments applied relatively similar blueprints by doubling down on emphasizing services, especially finance, which caused them to fall into crisis and recession with the United States. The UK welcomed the Chinese capital and didn't counterbalance with strategic investment in UK industry. On its part, at least the US was investing in innovation, creating tech giants we can point out today. The UK, on the other hand, had limited state investment in innovation or green manufacturing, which makes you wonder really. Why, you ask? Well, because the government did bring means to expand sectors such as higher education, but it didn't contribute in the way they had anticipated it would. In the early 2000s, the UK's economic climate received substantial growth and low unemployment. However, critics argued that rising public debt and dependence on private finance initiatives posed long-term risk. Overall, while many citizens saw tangible benefits, the policy's legacy remained mixed in light of post-2008 financial pressures. There's the student debt problem that's been experienced among UK citizens then and today, which was a direct result of the introduction of the tuition fees policy in the 90s. How substantial was this, you ask? The government decided to expand the policy in 2004 and again in 2012, ultimately leading to tuition fees of up to £9,000 a year in England. This in turn increased student debt significantly. A 2024 BBC article stipulated that almost 1.8 million people owe £50,000 or more. The Guardian shared its own piece backed by the Student Loans Company, highlighting that graduates owed an average amount of £45,000, with total outstanding debt at £205 billion in 2023. At the time of writing this, it is estimated that the average debt has moved from £45,000 to £53,000 according to the gov.uk statistical update. The repayment system tied to income helped reduce immediate burdens, but long-term effects include delayed home ownership, lower savings, and financial insecurity among graduates, especially those from low-income backgrounds. Yes, this policy improved university funding and access, but it also created lasting debt burdens for many. The Tony Blair and Gordon Brown governments significantly expanded public services, as I stated earlier, particularly in health, education, and welfare, resulting in notable improvements such as reduced National Health Service waiting times, increased school standards, and lower child poverty rates. The public spending increased from about 36% of GDP in 1999 to over 47% by 2009, so above 11% in just a decade. This was worryingly largely financed by increased government borrowing and continued spending during the 2008 financial crisis, as shown in this Institute for Fiscal Studies on Public Finances 1997 to 2010 review. While the investment did lead to service improvements and social gains, it also contributed to rising budget deficits, especially after tax revenues fell during the recession, raising concerns over long-term fiscal sustainability and leading to subsequent austerity measures after 2010. I will touch on these shortly. We can't also forget that the United Kingdom was also preoccupied with the war in Iraq in 2003, Afghanistan for the majority of the 2000s, and the war on terror. The UK averaged 2.3% GDP growth per year for this decade. The unemployment rate averaged 5.0%. Inflation averaged 2.4% per year. The poverty rate averaged 7.6%, and the real disposable income per capita was £18,950. While many lost homes in Detroit and Manchester, families in Chengdu and Wuhan moved into newly built high-rise apartments. China was not only escaping recession, it was upgrading its economy. The US and UK's lack of strategic planning, deindustrialization, and consumption-driven economies proved advantageous for the East Asian giant. In the ashes of a global crisis, one model exposed its fragility, the other its resilience. Now, entering the early 2010s, do you recall in a previous chapter when I said the US failed to protect its intellectual property, thus allowing China to copy and create similar models? We witnessed this with the birth of Alibaba, the closest American e-commerce equivalent of Amazon. There's the mega Chinese multinational corporation and technology company Huawei, which is the closest American telecommunications equivalent of Cisco Systems, Qualcomm, Juniper Networks, Ciena among others, smartphones and consumer electronics like Apple and Google. The cloud computing and AI competition with Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure is included. When you think about it, Huawei as a company stretches even farther by having multiple technological segments, like a semiconductor and chip design division, competing with Intel, AMD, and Nvidia. Huawei additionally has a surveillance and smart city technology wing that competes with Motorola Solutions, Palantir, and Honeywell. Yes, Huawei alone is competing with 11 plus US companies. Now think about what ByteDance is doing with TikTok, or Pinduoduo with Temu. All these companies built on strategic planning and underestimation in the previous 2 decades. China's socialism capitalist hybrid has ensured the resilience and backing of Chinese-founded companies, allowing them to grow much faster than through your traditional private sector funding and startup scaling methods often applied in the West. Now, with its domestic economy fortified, China turned outward, and the next chapter would take its model far beyond its borders, with roads, rail, ports, and pipelines. The Belt and Road Initiative, a new vision emerging from Beijing in 2013, one that would stretch across continents, oceans, and centuries of history. The Belt and Road Initiative wasn't just infrastructure, it was ideology in motion, a Marshall Plan without war, a trade network built not from Wall Street offices, but from state plans and steel rails. At its core, Chinese socialism scaling globally. The West promised development through free markets and IMF loans. China offered roads, power stations, fiber optic cables, and no lectures about democracy or budget cuts. Critics called it dead trap diplomacy, but for much of the global south, it looked like partnership, not paternalism. What do you think happens when a state starts shaping global trade itself? You get a country with trillions of dollars in surplus to invest through the same channels it traded on, to leverage its economy through gained trust and potential substantial returns, even if they're not monetary. China has become the top financier of African infrastructure, funding 1 in 5 projects and building 1 in 3 since 2012. Investments totaled $11.5 billion annually in the period between 2012 to 2016, which peaked around 2015 when mega projects such as Ethiopia's $3 billion railway, Kenya's $3.6 billion railway, Nigeria's $11.1 billion railway, and more were underway. China's policy banks, Exim and CDB, offered concessional loans and export credits. Financing models also brought in a shift toward public-private partnership and equity stakes in the following decade for sustainability. The infrastructure projects boosted trade, job creation, and development among the African nations. Headed across the Atlantic Ocean to the west, countries had just managed to make it out the financial intensive care unit and the global recession slump. The United States president was now Barack Obama. Right out of the gate, this administration implemented the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. This policy was an $800 billion stimulus package aimed to jumpstart the US economy through bringing about job creation, restoring consumer confidence via a combination of government spending, tax cuts, and social welfare expansion post-recession. The job creation and retention initiatives included over $100 billion in funding infrastructure projects like roads, bridges, transit systems, energy, broadband, and water projects to create construction and public sector jobs. There was support offered to education and healthcare jobs through direct aid to various states and local governments. This stimulus package assisted in the prevention of mass layoffs for teachers, members of police, and other public employees. To summarize, The entirety of the early 2010s period was pumped with aid programs to assist people who were affected, despite some of the reforms not being infrastructurally ready to address issues. I say it that way because urban areas and state capitals received more funding due to better administrative capacity and infrastructure readiness, whereas rural and underserved communities usually lacked an already established efficient system with administrators and managers to assist applicants who needed these federal grants, thus limiting job creations. This was unfortunate as the areas hit hardest by housing foreclosures, like the areas part of the Sunbelt region, recovered slower despite the stimulus initiatives. I'll have to make a separate video to discuss it in detail. Yes, there's that much nitty-gritty. The other policy introduced by the Obama administration was the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act 2010. This was a comprehensive financial regulatory law passed in response to the 2008 financial crisis, aiming to increase transparency, reduce systemic risk, and protect consumers from abusive financial practices like the risky behavior that led to the financial crisis. This was bundled with the Volcker Rule. This prohibited commercial banks from engaging in high-risk proprietary trading or investing in hedge funds and private equity for their own profit. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010 restored confidence in markets and decreased systemic risk, setting the wheels in motion for the economic expansion that was to follow, despite facing criticism for imposing heavy compliance burdens, especially on the smaller banks, and having to be watered down under lobbying pressure. In spite of all these flaws, both acts played a crucial role in repairing and reshaping American capitalism before the Trump administration took over in 2017. The Obama term's GDP growth averaged 1.67% annually, unemployment averaged 7.4%, inflation rate averaged 2.4% annually, poverty rate averaged 7.6%, and the real disposable income per capita was $42,300. We'll be back in the US in a moment. To the UK, a new coalition government had come to power in 2010, led by Prime Minister David Cameron on the right and Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg on the left. The population had been fed up with the Labour Party, citing a combination of economic concerns and public dissatisfaction with the Labour Party policies. For one, the 2008 financial crisis had impacted the UK quite badly. Rising unemployment, many houses lost, many businesses lost, and banks needing bailouts. Despite that being the case for various countries worldwide, a large number of UK voters felt that the Labour Party was liable for high government spending and rising debt. The opposition Conservative Party at that point had been advocating for fiscal responsibility through austerity measures that cut public spending and reduced the government's budget deficit. This message resonated with many of the UK people concerned about the country's economic future. This newly appointed coalition government brought in emergency stimulus measures. This was temporary and was soon converted into austerity measures. By simple definition, austerity measures are a set of economic policies usually consisting of tax increases, spending cuts, or a combination of the two, used by governments to reduce budget deficits and expenditures exceeding government revenues. I do also want to note that the Welfare Reform Act of 2012 was launched and it introduced universal credit and other welfare changes. Though we'll primarily be focusing on the austerity measures because that also affected welfare initiatives. The United Kingdom's government opted for large-scale cuts to public spending rather than focusing on tax increases. These plans to reduce public debt through these spending cuts, primarily in welfare, local government, and infrastructure, were in fact a much higher price to pay. The government cut public investments in areas like welfare, healthcare, infrastructure, and education, while the system backfired by creating persistent inequality, poverty, a housing crisis, suppressed consumer spending, and human capital development. The reduced government spending weakened demand and delayed recovery from the 2008 financial crisis. To summarize it, these policies did reduce the deficit. In 2010, the UK's budget deficit was at approximately £159 billion, or 10% of GDP, one of the highest among advanced economies after the global financial crisis. By 2019, right before the COVID-19 pandemic, the deficit had fallen to around £41 billion, or 1.8% of GDP, a £118 billion reduction and a decline of more than 70% in cash terms. However, like I just said, this came with a lot of sacrifice for the country. Public services were weakened, causing institutions like the National Health Service, NHS, and local councils to face chronic underfunding, staff shortages, increased waiting times, and reduced social care support. Simultaneously, austerity disproportionately affected low-income households and marginalized communities, widening income and regional inequality, as welfare cuts and regressive policies hit the most vulnerable hardest. Wages remained flat, and most regions outside London struggled to recover. These outcomes challenged the long-term effectiveness as well as displayed long-term imbalances and fairness of austerity as a fiscal strategy. With the US and UK in a recovery and regulation crackdown during this period, their ability to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative had been quite low. The International Monetary Fund, a major financial agency of the United Nations and an international financial institution funded by 191 member countries, had implemented structural adjustment policies from 2013. The IMF had also offered support to African countries, but not in the way China did. The IMF offered loans tied to austerity, fiscal discipline, subsidy cuts, privatization, and currency reforms in the receiving country. This was a common requirement in countries like Kenya, Zambia, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and more throughout the 2010s and early 2020s. Some of the mentioned countries that accepted this proposal from the IMF often suffered economic and social impacts like inflation, higher unemployment, reduced public services, and widened inequality. In Pakistan, for example, there are strong separate sources that discuss how IMF-related conditions and debt burdens have contributed to industrial decline in the country. In Kenya, historical austerity and IMF conditions since the 1990s shaped the context for the 2023 to 2024 anti-IMF protests. This had nations on the African continent debate the criticisms and consequences of taking these loans, often viewing them through lenses of structural violence, when austerity hit the vulnerable populations hardest. These loans underlined dependence on IMF, limited the receiving nation's sovereignty, and often facilitated elite political capture and corruption. To simply put it, the difference between China's infrastructure deals versus the IMF's structural adjustments was, for one, China's objective was building physical infrastructure, your rails, ports, energy, etc., whereas the IMF provided macroeconomic, reform and loan support. Secondly, China's financing came from its policy bank loans, public-private partnerships, concessional credit and equity, whereas the IMF's financing is conditional loans tied to austerity reforms. Thirdly, China's focus was growth via construction and development. The IMF's focus was stability via fiscal discipline and reforms. Fourthly, the outcome of China's infrastructure deals were improved transport and hidden debt risks. On the other hand, the IMF's outcomes were inflation, poverty, social unrest, etc. Now to the fifth point. The public reaction to China's effort was mixed, often pragmatic acceptance, whereas for the IMF it was often hostile, with evidence of riots and protests. Point number 6. China's sustainability strategy has been by pivoting toward public-private partnerships. The IMF is experiencing ongoing controversy over dependence and fairness. The bottom line is, China's deals have delivered tangible infrastructure, boosting trade and connectivity without concerns over debt stress, sovereignty, and project quality. The IMF policies aim for fiscal stability but frequently impose economic hardship, social tension, and political backlash in borrower countries. The Belt and Road Initiative deserves its own video. What I've told you is just the highlights of its overall mission. I chose to simplify it in this context for you to comprehend its stature and impact in a strategic geopolitical competition. Unlike the West's foreign aid, China's strategy was rooted in reciprocation. We'll build your future if you help fuel ours. To Washington and London, this was economic encroachment. To Nairobi, Belgrade, and Islamabad, it looked like progress. For the first time in centuries, the world's most ambitious infrastructure network didn't lead outward from the West, it led from Beijing. When President Donald Trump and the Republican administration took over between 2017 to 2021, they inherited a stable, low unemployment economy with rising wages, a bullish stock market, and strong corporate earnings. There was relatively low interest rates, giving room for tax and investment policies to stimulate further. So the Trump administration's challenge was less about recovering and more about accelerating growth. This administration targeted tax cuts, which were labeled the most significant overhauls of the US tax system in decades. This was due to the Trump administrator's introduction of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act 2017, or the TCJA, that aimed to stimulate the US's capitalist economy by reducing tax burdens, incentivizing investment, and boosting economic growth. The corporate tax rate was reduced from 35% down to 21%, thus making the US more globally competitive and encouraged both national and foreign companies to invest domestically. The firms that did so benefited from full expensing of capital investments that encouraged equipment and infrastructure upgrades. The results of these corporate tax cuts caused a temporary spike in capital expenditures and corporate earnings, which supported stock market growth and business confidence. That wasn't all, of course. This TCJA lessened personal income tax rates across most brackets and doubled the standard deduction, thus increasing take-home pay for tons of citizens. Supporters of the TCJA were focused on the job creation and economic growth aspect of the act, which ended up seeing a spike in employment between 2018 and 2019, a period where unemployment was at historic lows. The US's GDP growth reached 2.9% in 2018 due to part aiding through the fiscal stimulus from tax cuts. The act encouraged multinational companies to bring money back to the United States by imposing a one-time tax on overseas corporate profits. An example company, Apple, brought back over $200 billion to commit to domestic investment. The TCJA didn't just incentivize the big companies, it incentivized small businesses by introducing a 20% deduction on pass-through income for eligible small businesses, family businesses, sole proprietors, and/or entrepreneurs. The Trump administration brought this along with the 2017 tariffs. Yes, they began back then. These were part of the administration's broader America First trade agenda that aimed at reducing the United States trade deficit, reviving domestic manufacturing, and protecting American jobs. The economic effects of this were complex and widely debated. The tariffs had a mix of short-term strategic gains and long-term structural challenges. The protection for domestic industries were mainly against the Chinese goods coming into America, like steel, aluminium, solar panels, washing machines, and more. The United States steel and aluminium producers were to benefit from reduced foreign competition, leading to increased production and some employment gains in the short term. A portion of factories were reopened, or if they were already operating, output was increased in response to tariff protections. There was stimulus issued for businesses in select sectors that invested domestically rather than outsourcing production. The solar panel tariff, for example, led certain firms to consider local assembly plants to avoid tax duties. The Trump administrators argued that this would rebuild US industrial capacity in strategic sectors. The tariffs were utilized as bargaining tools in revising trade deals such as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or the USMCA, that replaced the Clinton administration's North American Free Trade Agreement, known as NAFTA. This act wasn't all perfect. It had its limitations and consequences. The higher input costs for manufacturers caused prices to increase and reduced competitiveness for downstream industries like automotive, agricultural, and retail. The Chinese government had imposed retaliatory tariffs, which hurt the United States farmers and exporters, prompting the government to issue a $28 billion grant to offset losses. A range of economists are in agreement that the impact of these tariffs of the mitigation of the GDP and job creation was modest or slightly negative, and consumer prices rose in several product categories. The 2017 Trump tariffs provided short-term relief and leverage for certain US industries. This encouraged local production and helped reposition the US in trade negotiations that fit a protectionist capitalist strategy. However, their long-term benefits were limited by higher costs for consumers, trade retaliations, and global supply chain disruptions with strained foreign relationships, which ultimately dimmed the broader economic gains for American consumers and businesses. The consequences and limitations of the earlier executive, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act 2017, revealed that the benefits of this act were biased toward higher-income individuals and large corporations. Budget deficits grew significantly, with the Congressional Budget Office estimating a $1.9 trillion increase in the deficit over 10 years, without the anticipated growth to offset it. The wealth inequality has widened as the richest 1% gained more from stock gains and tax savings than lower-income groups. Overall, the TCJA stimulated short-term economic activity, encouraged business investment, and lowered taxes for many. However, its long-term benefits remain debated due to rising deficits and unequal wealth distribution. These policies also introduced uncertainty into global markets, discouraged some investment, and widened income inequality, all of which undermined inclusive economic growth and weakened the resilience of parts of the US economy heading into the COVID-19 crisis. Now, in the United Kingdom, the leaders that held office for the latter half of the 2010s weren't primarily occupied with correcting deficits and gaining more for the economy at the same rate and manner the United States did. After the Cameron-Clegg coalition implemented austerity measures in the early 2010s, the country just couldn't seem to get it right for the remainder of the decade. Political debates were at an all-time high. Opposition party members like this man right here, Nigel Farage, the then leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, had been advocating that the UK would benefit more being out of the European Union. Yes, Nigel Farage, among many Eurosceptics, it's in the name if you're wondering what they are, European skepticism. He and others believe that the United Kingdom would benefit more outside the European Union because the UK would regain full sovereignty over its laws, borders, and immigration policy, free from European Union regulations and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. They argue that a Britain exit would allow the UK to negotiate its own trade deals, reduce financial contributions to the EU budget, and prioritize domestic interests in economic, legal, and immigration matters. A large portion of people also felt that European Union membership imposed bureaucratic constraints that limited the UK's global competitiveness and democratic self-determination. This was a 7-year political and economic gamble. We made an entire video about the timeline of the events that transpired here on the channel, titled The Great Disaster, A Sovereign Decision and No Vision. For this video, we will be summarizing to save time. A referendum was drafted in 2016, where voters could choose if they wanted the nation to leave or remain in the European Union. The Leave vote won. 52% of the UK population wanted Britain to leave the European Union, and 48% voted for the UK to remain in the European Union. Prime Minister David Cameron resigned, and Theresa May took over. Yes, the Conservative Party was still the ruling party. 2017 arrived. The UK triggered Article 50, which began the 2-year countdown for the UK's exit from the European Union. Which brings me to 2020. I am aware I said 2 years, but there were delays in this process. During that year of 2020, the UK Parliament eventually passed the withdrawal agreement. The UK left the European Union Single Market, and the European Union Customs Union, an often regretted error. Firstly, it's costed the UK more economically due to trade restrictions. This in turn has also harmed the UK's GDP growth compared to its EU peers. Secondly, The UK's exit from the EU lowered the helpful immigrant traffic into the United Kingdom to assist in sectors such as hospitality, agriculture, and healthcare. Thirdly, the politicians' hope for establishing better trade deals didn't materialize in a manner that could dethrone the European Union's market access and influence in global politics. Oftentimes, the UK is not viewed like the global power it once was. Fourthly, the economic freedoms that were promised to this country through advocated sovereign control ignored the increased admin and inflation that the UK's had to experience without much reason really. This in all has in fact proved economists' calculations that the UK's economy is estimated to be smaller than it would have been had it remained in the European Union, as investment has diminished, as well as import expenses and inflation are higher than expected. UK exports to EU members face more paperwork. The service sector, especially in finance, lost access advantages. This matter still divides UK politics. On one side, there's regrets with calls for closer association or even rejoining the EU. On the other side, there's just calls for more reforms. The polls have certainly shown that more believe this was a mistake. That's not even the worst part. The Conservative Party went through 3 different prime ministers in that space of 4 years from 2016 to 2020. To measure just how bad that is, that was basically Trump's entire term if he took office in 2016 instead of 2017 and left in 2020 instead of 2021. How could things have been so bad that the UK had more people lead the country in the same time to just navigate a costly decision for the nation's economy? For this decade between 2010 and 2020, the UK economy achieved a GDP growth of 2.3%, an unemployment rate of 5.9%, an inflation rate of 1.9%, a staggering poverty rate of 21%, and the real disposable income of £21,000. To compare this to the 2000 to 2010 decade, GDP didn't grow, unemployment and poverty surged to worrying numbers, the poverty rate itself almost tripled. Would you believe me if I said it's only going to get worse in the next chapter? We'll first be headed back to East Asia, where China's most powerful global advertisement wasn't a policy, it was a moment. A moment when the entire world stopped, when economies froze, when systems were tested. In early 2020, a new virus began to spread. In Wuhan, China locked down entire cities, mobilized the military, and built hospitals in days. We can credit this to the nation's command and control system that enabled mass mobilization, state ownership and control over key construction firms, readily positioned military and SOEs rapidly to be deployed, land and labor could be redirected without negotiating or bidding. The nation utilized its urban neighborhood committees and rural grid managers to monitor every household, track movement and symptoms, enforce curfews and lockdowns, deliver food and medicine. These grid units were already established in the years prior for the means of social visibility and enforcement, so by the time COVID hit, they were repurposed instantly. The system gave the nation hyper-local visibility and enforcement without requiring police at every door. In addition to the grid management systems, China incorporated state technology fusion for surveillance and contact tracing by deploying QR code-based health apps via Alipay as well as WeChat to track infections, movement, and quarantine status. The Chinese Communist Party leaned on large technology giants like Alibaba and Tencent, who were tasked with integrating government orders without privacy lawsuits or opt-in delays. This advancement allowed for real-time biosurveillance networks across 1.4 billion people, which is quite unfathomable in most liberal democracies. Now, another strategic advantage the Chinese had that proved useful during this period was the lack of electoral or judicial delays commonly associated with Western governments. The Chinese government didn't need parliamentary approval, court orders, or legal waivers to shut down cities, enforce quarantine, mobilize medical staff, seize private facilities, or supply chains. Contrast this with the United States or the UK, where pandemic decisions were delayed or challenged by courts, media, or opposition parties. We're going to go through the performance-driven bureaucracy of the compared nations now. In China's system, local officials are promoted based on compliance and metrics, for example, in virus containment, economic recovery, etc. The COVID pandemic became a test of political loyalty and competence, which ended up incentivizing fast action, full compliance, and extreme caution. So to summarize the performance-driven activity, Chinese cities and provinces were competing to show zero-case records and rapid recovery. The results in the early phase of 2020, according to the World Health Organization China Joint Mission Report, Our World in Data, showed the following. To close out China's command and control system, it enabled unified leadership, instant local execution, military speed infrastructure build-out, and artificial intelligence-driven population management, all without the friction of democracy. Now, this may have been helpful in China's early phase, but later in the years, this caused a delayed exit strategy due to the zero-COVID inertia. There was also widespread suppressed data transparency accusations aimed at them. Lastly, there was economical and psychological harm caused as a result of the nation's prolonged lockdown. China's model was excellent at suppression, but less agile at adaptation. In the West, leaders downplayed the threat, delayed travel bans, testing, and watched as systems cracked under pressure. The pandemic became a stress test, and Chinese socialism passed with brutal efficiency. Means to keep people at bay during this time of stress was through information that was carefully distributed to citizens. The Chinese Communist Party's tactic to gain control of this proved helpful for their nation, as they centralized the narrative as well as orchestrated state unity through their state-controlled media ecosystem comprising of CCTV, Xinhua, and People's Daily to tightly control the information released. The messages are top-down, consistent across platforms, and aligned with the state's goals. The narrative that was pushed during this COVID-19 period was that of national solidarity, heroic medical workers, and the effectiveness of government interventions. President Xi Jinping was portrayed as a strong leader, commanding the people's war against the virus. Wuhan was framed as a symbol of national resilience and sacrifice, helping shape a shared identity. Dissenting voices of any other information, including those of early whistleblowers, were swiftly censored. The success of lockdowns, mass testing, construction, and digital tracking was emphasized to highlight Chinese governance superiority, especially over the West. This resulted in a manufactured national unity, with most of the population receiving uniform messaging to reinforce collective action. This narrative assisted in legitimizing the Chinese Communist Party's authority. Public criticism was limited not only by censorship, but also by national sentiment, amplified by the media. In contrast, the West was riddled with disinformation and polarization. See, the West generally has a fragmented and partisan media landscape. The US, for example, has a free press system with diverse outlets ranging from your CNN, MSNBC, and the New York Times to Fox News and right-wing social media networks. This decentralization, while promoting freedom, also allowed inconsistent, often contradictory information to spread. The disinformation and misinformation was rife on social media platforms, as it became a vector for conspiracy theorists discussing on whether or not COVID was a hoax, the anti-vaccine propaganda, and 5G links. Right-wing media often downplayed the virus, opposed lockdowns and masks, opting to echo Trump's politicized stance. These conflicting messages from federal versus state officials contributed to eroding the public's trust. COVID-19 became a culture war issue. Democrats largely supported restrictions on vaccines, whilst many Republicans resisted them. Scientific institutions like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, known as the CDC, were undermined in public discourse. Overall, the media environment amplified division, not unity. So while the US media ecosystem was free, it allowed for ideological chaos, exposing the vulnerability of liberal democracies to disinformation in a time of crisis. Whereas China used media as a nationalistic tool for collective cohesion and regime legitimacy, the Chinese Communist Party saw the crisis as an opportunity to demonstrate strength. On the note of strength, the West's offshored and outsourced production to China proved detrimental when the nations were faced with the pandemic. There was a medical supply shock as personal protective equipment, ventilators, and pharmaceuticals were needed to combat. Shortages became acute in the United States, United Kingdom, and European Union because over 70% of global mask production was based in China. Exports of masks and protective gear was restricted by China when they were hit by the outbreak in the first 2 months of 2020, leaving Western nations scrambling for supplies in March and April. A real case situation was when the US strategic national stockpile was severely underprepared, and 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients for common drugs were imported largely from India and China. The US Department of Health and Human Services reported that hospitals were reusing masks and rationing ventilators, largely due to outsourced manufacturing and no fallback domestic capacity. The Western nations' reliance on the just-in-time inventory system, which is a management strategy that aligns raw material orders from suppliers directly with production schedules, meant that companies had no buffer stocks. So basically, when the Chinese factories shut down, everything from iPhones to auto parts stalled. Companies like Apple, General Motors, and Nike saw supply chain paralysis because their Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers were concentrated in the China Pearl River Delta or Hubei province. Sticking on the topic of American companies, General Motors shut down plants in the United States and Canada for weeks in early 2020 because it couldn't get wiring harnesses from suppliers in Wuhan, China. The production channel issues carried over to a shipping and container crisis as China's early lockdowns delayed port activity, causing a container mismatch globally. Ports in Europe and the United States had no incoming containers, while Chinese ports became congested. Western companies dependent on cheap container freight from China had to pay 300 to 500% higher rates by late 2020 to 2021. To use a real-life example, in December 2020, the cost of shipping a container from Shanghai to Los Angeles rose from $1,300 to over $5,000, in turn impacting small Western importers and retailers severely. This crisis ignited a strategic rethink in Europe and the US. The nations began calls for reshoring and/or friendshoring, basically moving production to allies. This was done through strategic stockpile reforms, industrial policy debates over critical infrastructure, and national security. Governments arrived at the realization that they had ceded too much supply chain sovereignty to a single country. Germany launched a €1 billion initiative to onshore pharmaceutical manufacturing, while the United States passed the CHIPS and Science Act in 2022 to boost domestic semiconductor production. This pandemic became a real-time case study in how Western individualist capitalism and Chinese collective socialism approached crisis management with vastly different values, tools, and trade-offs. Western countries like the United States, United Kingdom, and parts of Europe operated under ideologies rooted in individual liberty, free market efficiency, and personal choice. The key features I want to touch on during COVID comprised of voluntary compliance, where mask wearing, lockdowns, and vaccinations were often suggested but not universally enforced until later periods. There was high resistance to mandates as they were often framed as a violation of personal freedom. The political debates framed health measures as authoritarian overreach. The decentralized health systems in the US, for instance, had individual states respond differently. Some were strict, others led the policy of leaving things to take their own course without interfering. Federal response lacked coordination, exposing cracks in privatized healthcare. Reopening economies was a top political priority. Capitalist logic pushed governments to balance saving lives versus saving gross domestic product. Citizens were expected to evaluate risks and make rational choices for themselves. This delayed collective action and often caused waves of preventable deaths. The outcomes of this clash had people's right to choose conflict with public health imperatives. Individualism slowed coordinated response and sometimes undermined trust in science. China, in contrast, operated under a form of state-led socialism with collectivist roots, prioritizing unity, social order, and top-down control. This was in full display when they applied the zero-COVID strategy, initially with massive rapid lockdowns and military-style precision. Entire cities were tested in days, with positive cases being isolated instantly. Health codes, facial recognition, and location tracking apps controlled movement. Those violating rules were fined or detained. Privacy was secondary to containment. The central government issued commands for unified response. Provinces followed without question. Hospitals were built in 10 days, and national resources were mobilized at scale. Collective suffering was normalized. I quote one of the sayings from Chinese officials: "We must protect each other." The state utilized propaganda to frame compliance as patriotic and virtuous. China was efficient in early suppression, but overly rigid, which later caused backlash in a notable example like the Shanghai lockdowns. There was limited individual freedoms for collective safety, a trade-off Western democracies could not easily make. Western capitalism struggled because it couldn't mobilize a unified fast response without infringing on personal liberties, an ideological red line. This wasn't just a system issue, from years of offloading and outsourcing. The UK, for instance, was marred in economic and political confusion, as whilst the nation was simultaneously occupied with COVID, Britain's exit from the EU occurred in January 2020. Between January 2020 and January 2022, the aftermath of Britain's exit from the European Union saw political and social disruption in the UK. The formal exit from the European Union on the 31st of January 2020 was followed by a transition period ending in December 2020, after which new trade barriers emerged under the United Kingdom, European Union trade and cooperation agreements. Businesses faced custom delays, increased costs, and supply chain disruptions, particularly in sectors like fishing, agriculture, and manufacturing. Labor shortages intensified due to the end of free movement, hitting healthcare, logistics, and hospitality. Northern Ireland experienced political tension and trade complications under the Northern Ireland Protocol. Meanwhile, the pound remained fluctuating, and UK-EU trade volumes dipped before partially recovering. Politically, Brexit fueled division, with growing calls for Scottish independence and renewed debate over the Union's future. The UK's GDP contracted due to a dual shock of the pandemic and Brexit by nearly 10%, the worst decline in over 300 years due to the strict lockdowns and global disruptions. The government under Boris Johnson and Chancellor Rishi Sunak rolled out massive fiscal support, including the furlough scheme, grants for business, and value-added tax cuts. By 2021, the economy began recovering, with GDP rebounding by around 7.5%, supported by vaccine rollouts and easing restrictions. However, Brexit introduced lasting trade friction, like the earlier mentioned labour shortages and inflationary pressures. Supply chain issues, energy price spikes, and declining EU trade compounded challenges. By early 2022, the UK faced a cost of living crisis, rising inflation, and uncertainty about long-term productivity post-Brexit. Headed over to the United States, between the same period of January 2020 to January 2022, the US economy underwent severe turbulence, followed by an aggressive recovery marked by a presidential transition from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. Under Trump in 2020, the economy entered a sharp recession due to the COVID-19 pandemic, with gross domestic product contracting by 3.4%, the worst since World War II. Unemployment spiked to nearly 15% in April 2020, prompting emergency stimulus packages like the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, the largest stimulus package to date. This aimed to cushion households, businesses, and healthcare systems during the pandemic. The drawbacks of the stimulus included many large politically connected firms receiving aid more easily than underserved small businesses, which defeated the purpose of the Paycheck Protection Program in the Act, aimed at offering forgivable loans to help small businesses keep employees on payroll. A portion of citizens managed to find loopholes to claim fraudulently. Some even went as far as claiming against deceased people. According to Brookings, a significant share of unemployment benefits and stimulus payments were delayed or inaccessible for many low-income or elderly households. The Economic Policy Institute mentions that despite the huge stimulus allocation, the CARES Act was still not enough to fully protect workers or reboot the economy. See, UNC Analysis noted the unique nature of a pandemic-induced recession limited the effectiveness of traditional relief tools. The Congressional Budget Office projected the act would increase deficits by nearly $1.7 trillion over 10 years, partly due to lost revenue and direct spending. Though this couldn't be avoided much because it was due to unforeseen circumstances, unlike the other situations in the previous chapters. The first Trump administration had an average GDP growth of 2.3%, an unemployment rate of 4.1%, an inflation rate of 1.9%, a poverty rate of 10.5%, and a real disposable income of $48,000. Trump managed to boost Obama's economy. The only bad thing here is the poverty rate increased by 3%. When President Biden took office in January 2021, he inherited a recovering but fragile economy. His administration launched the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan in March 2021, which extended direct payments to Americans, boosted unemployment benefits, and funded vaccination efforts. This assisted in driving rapid GDP growth around 5.7% in 2021, the highest in decades, alongside strong job creation. To summarize this chapter, the pandemic revealed a painful truth. The world's wealthiest capitalist nations, who claimed to be the most advanced, were unprepared, uncoordinated, and divided. Meanwhile, China, long criticized for its centralized governance, showed the power of coordinated socialist-driven response. But this wasn't the end of the race. As China's growth accelerated, it made a bolder pivot, one that challenged not just economics, but the very meaning of freedom, governance, and the future of global order. For decades, GDP was the scorecard of power, but now, a deeper game is being played. Who writes the rules of the future? China isn't just building roads and railways anymore. It's building a new operating system for the world. In the West, tech innovation is privatized, built by billionaires and answerable to shareholders. In China, tech is nationalized in vision, even if privatized in form. The state sets the agenda: security, efficiency, and unity, and that agenda is spreading. Onwards from 2022, China has aggressively expanded its version of globalization, anchored in state-led exports, digital infrastructure, and AI governance reform. See, under the Belt and Road Initiative and upgraded trade pacts like the ASEAN-China FTA 3.0 in 2025, Beijing is exporting hardware such as 5G, data centers, smart city systems, as well as digital connectivity to developing economies. Simultaneously, the nation has rolled out a layered AI ethics and standards framework, accelerating from policy design to mandatory regulation. Since 2022, the Cyberspace Administration has enacted laws on algorithmic recommendation, deep synthesis content, and generative artificial intelligence measures effective as of August 2023. Technical bodies like the TC260 and MIIT have issued over 50 national artificial intelligence standards, including content labeling, security structure frameworks, and model safety guidelines. China's approach blends industrial ambitions with state-controlled governance, shaping a digital globalization that's mercantilist, yet rules-driven. Meanwhile, Its global AI offerings like Alibaba's Qwen LLM challenge Western models, prompting international tensions over semiconductors, export controls, and competing ethical regimes. This dual push building new global technology infrastructure and simultaneously enforcing tight ethical technical frameworks positions China as an influential engine in the emerging digital order, especially across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. I will be moving on to the US and China's representation of two contrasting global models of digital governance, infrastructure, exportation, and artificial intelligence, reflecting deeper philosophical divides. Beginning with the United States Liberty First model, the nation continues to champion a decentralized, private sector-driven innovation ecosystem grounded in civil liberties, market freedom, and democratic norms. The key characteristics between 2022 and 2025 comprised of free expression and privacy-focused AI regulation. Under the system, there's emphasis on voluntary AI ethics, transparency, and civil liberties. Examples include former US President Biden's 2023 AI Executive Order and NIST AI Risk Management Framework. US firms like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google developed cutting-edge large language models like GPT-4, Claude, and Gemini, often with open models or public application, programming, interface access, fueling global democratization of artificial intelligence tools. The private sector's leadership on tech giants led research and development for the government to play catch-up. Public-private artificial intelligence safety alliances like Frontier Model Forum were mostly voluntary. US firms exported models as well as chips prior to restrictions and cloud infrastructure to allies under market-first principles. Artificial intelligence and standards promote multi-stakeholder governance via OECD, G7 Hiroshima Process, and AI Seoul Summit 2024. The US's efforts to counter China's digital exports included stricter export controls on chips and pressures on allies to block Huawei and ZTE technology. Challenges experienced through these initiatives are listed as follows. There's fragmented regulation across states and sectors. There's lack of cohesive national artificial intelligence law at the time of producing this. There's a struggle with misinformation, data monopolies, and race-to-the-bottom platform dynamics. Now, as we move to contrast this with China's order-first model, we'll be focusing on this nation's advanced state-centric, stability-first model, prioritizing control, moral alignment, and national security. The key characteristics included centralized AI governance, with mandatory rules on deepfakes in 2023, generative AI in 2023, recommendation algorithms in 2022, and personal data use. There was technical standardization through bodies like TC260 and Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, backed by the Cyberspace Administration of China. There's been an export of digital infrastructure and governance via the Belt and Road Digital Silk Road exports such as 5G through Huawei, surveillance systems through Dahua and Hikvision, as well as data centers and smart cities. AI exports have been bundled with governance frameworks, particularly to the Global South and Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. China's AI-aligned core socialist values allow for models to be censored or aligned by default. Examples are your Alibaba's Qwen and Baidu's Ernie. There's absolutely zero tolerance for unapproved political or historical narratives, with state oversight embedded in infrastructure. The challenges the nation has been dealt with for this are listed as follows. 1. Geopolitical suspicion around surveillance technology. 2. Sanctions and chip export bans slowed progress in frontier AI. An example includes restricted access to NVIDIA H100Ss. Lastly, innovation being increasingly nationalized may stifle academic openness or global collaboration. In summary of this capitalist and nationalist comparison between the two nations, the results show that in the US's case, its model is more competitive but fragmented, which is ideal for its environment of open societies and startups. China's model, on the other hand, has created an integrated and export-ready system, appealing to governments prioritizing stability and turnkey systems. Overall, we've basically been dealt with a competition of tech dominance and ideological leadership in the digital age. We'll now be moving on to our third point, China's focus on long-term planning, digital sovereignty, and the fusion of party oversight with innovation. See, China continues to pursue multi-decade initiatives like Made in China 2025 and the 14th Five-Year Plan beginning in 2021 until 2035, aiming to dominate next-gen tech into 2030 and beyond. In March 2024, Beijing announced nationwide campaigns to achieve tech self-sufficiency in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, semiconductors, and big data. The ultimate goal is to reduce external dependency amid the global technology tensions. Dating back to 2023, China institutionalized its ambition with the launch of the National Data Administration, coordinating data infrastructure and enforcing data localization under Personal Information Protection Law 2021. This drive is part of the broader Digital China strategy of building sovereign 5G and 6G data centers and smart city systems under strict state regulation. This is the intersection where oversight has previously met innovation. The Chinese Communist Party-led institutional control created the Central Science and Technology Commission, bringing science under governmental authority. Another institution called the Central Cyberspace Affairs Commission navigates cybersecurity and online governance, in turn blurring the lines between censorship, public services, and party narrative control. Finally, the foundational institution in all this, called the Central Financial Commission, similarly extends Chinese Communist Party authority into digital finance and fintech. China continues to leverage its major tech companies as national champions organizations, aligning them with state-led research and development targets. Many firms in the nation have government-linked board seats and strategic mandates. Simultaneously, the Communist Party's Little Giants program fosters around 10,000 specialized SMEs in niche deep tech sectors to ensure grassroots innovation under state oversight. In summary, China's current tech trajectory is characterized by decade-spanning plans that are firstly purpose-built to ensure global leadership. Secondly, to ensure data control as well as infrastructure autonomy by securing sovereign digital spaces. Thirdly, have party-embedded innovation governance combining top-down direction with corporate incentives. Fourthly, incorporate a hybrid innovation model centralized by oversight and mixed ownership, yet open to global partnership where beneficial. This techno-status model underscores China's aim to become a self-reliant digital power, leveraging centralized planning and party control as key strategic assets in the global race. We will be moving to the fourth point to ultimately cement the stature of this matter. Between 2022 and 2025, many global South nations increasingly favored Chinese digital platforms, infrastructure, and AI systems over Western alternatives. This preference is driven by a combination of economic pragmatism, sovereignty concerns, and ideological alignments. Let's go deeper into why. To start off, China is at an advantage by being able to offer affordable bundled infrastructure packages, including hardware, software, training, and financing, all under the Digital Silk Road or Broader Belt and Road initiative. This has been displayed with smart cities, surveillance systems, cloud platforms, and 5G being delivered faster and cheaper than Western options. Chinese vendors often include long-term maintenance, local job creation, and soft loans or grants via state-backed banks like the China Development Bank. As we've come to know throughout the chapters, this is financially irresistible for many African and Southeast Asian governments, especially where budget constraints are tight. Western partnerships, especially with the United States or European Union, often come with conditions tied to data privacy laws, labor rights, democratic governance or anti-corruption requirements, environmental and ethical standards. In contrast, China continues emphasizing non-interference in domestic affairs, like no lectures on government or transparency, and no requirements to reform political institutions. This has thus made Chinese platforms more alluring to authoritarian-leaning or hybrid regimes who want control without scrutiny. This is important as many Global South countries are wary of US-centric platforms that dominate global data flows and are subject to Western surveillance or sanctions. The Chinese have capitalized on this through alternative offerings such as on-premises hosting, data localization, and custom governance models. With this, governments have often backdoor access, aiding state control. The models are basically aligned with cyber sovereignty. Each state controls its own digital space without foreign interference. China strategically positions itself as an equal partner to the Global South, not a former colonial power. This resonates in diplomatic rhetoric through structures like BRICS, South-to-South solidarity, China to Africa forums, China to Asian digital partnerships, and Belt and Road digital conferences. So a shared vision of development without democratization in a nutshell. The Chinese technology giants Huawei, ZTE, Dahua, Alibaba, and Tencent are deliberately offering robust alternatives to Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Cisco. Large language models and AI platforms, Alibaba Quinn and Baidu Ernie, even cater to these nations in their local languages. Services that have been planned to be rendered include full-scale surveillance, e-government, and fintech deployment are already on trial in China. This substantial shift reflects not just tech economics, but a broader ideological and strategic realignment, one where the Global South asserts autonomy and experiments with new digital sovereignty models, often aligned more closely with China's order-driven digital vision than the West's liberty-first framework. Washington warns of techno-authoritarianism, but in much of the world, China offers a model that works, one that delivers development, infrastructure, and digital tools without political interference. In the eyes of many, Beijing isn't replacing the West's ideology, it's exposing its weakness. In our focus on the US and UK as primary examples, we witness system shocks and leaders' administrative terms shift with policies, which unfortunately caused the nations to be pulled in conflicting directions when Beijing was following a streamlined approach all along. In the US's case, Donald Trump's economic policies closing out in 2020 were rooted in traditional capitalist principles, prioritizing tax cuts for corporations, deregulation, and trade protectionism aimed at reshoring American industry and boosting private sector growth. However, when Joe Biden took office in 2021, his administration shifted course toward a more state-led capitalist model, emphasizing government investment in infrastructure, clean energy, and social programs, while raising corporate taxes and increasing regulation. This marked a clear ideological conflict. Trump's market-first approach prioritized private capital and low taxes, whereas Biden's policies reasserted government as an economic actor, aiming to correct market failures and reduce inequality within the capitalist framework. In 2025, Trump is now back in office, steering the US economy in the direction he and his administration see fit, with extremely volatile outcomes. At the current rate of having this continuous back and forth between Democrat and Republican governments, it will unfortunately be quite difficult to compete with China's consistent party system. To compare the economic figures under Trump's first term versus Biden, every category during Biden's term saw an increase for better or worse. GDP grew by 0.9%, unemployment went up by 0.7%, inflation alone tripled, the poverty rate went up by 1.9%, and the disposable income grew by $3,800. Now moving on to the UK's case, its capitalist economic policy shifted significantly with changes in leadership. Under Prime Minister Boris Johnson until mid-2022, the country's focus was on state-backed stimulus post-COVID, including large public spending and, in quotes, leveling up regional development blending capitalist growth with interventionist support. However, due to a wave of ministerial resignations and mounting pressure over multiple scandals, including his handling of an MP's misconduct case and breaches of lockdown rules, he resigned. Liz Truss briefly took office replacing him. She attempted a sharp turn to free market supply-side economics with major unfunded tax cuts, which triggered market instability, investor panic, and overall financial market turmoil, thus leading to a rebellion within her own party. She resigned too. Rishi Sunak entered the Prime Minister's office to replace her in late 2022. He decided on a more cautious, fiscally conservative approach, aiming to stabilize markets, reduce inflation, and control spending, while still promoting business confidence and growth. Unfortunately, he struggled to connect with the public, often being perceived as out of touch, overly privileged, and lacking authenticity. By late 2024, the Conservative Party and all its leaders were out the door. The Labour Party, led by Keir Starmer, was victorious in the elections, with strategy rooted in service, security, and stability, focusing on restoring trust in government, economic competence, and pragmatic reform over ideological radicalism. As of 2025 already, there is still political instability in the country. The Labour Party is facing the furnace, with no compass on where the country will be headed. Do you recall in the last chapter, when I asked would you be surprised if it got worse? Let's take a look at the UK's economic numbers. Between 2019 and 2022, when Johnson was still Prime Minister, the UK averaged 0.8% GDP growth, a 4.2% unemployment average, an inflation rate average of 3.6%, a poverty rate average of 22%, and a real disposable income of £20,250. Now, when you compare these numbers to the 2010 to 2020 decade, overall you'll see that it did in fact get worse. Notably, GDP growth decreased by 1.5%, almost no growth at all. Inflation went up by 1.7%, and the real disposable income went down £1,692. That is where you get an idea of how much of an effect Brexit and COVID had on the country. Right after the 3-year period of 2019 to 2022, you get the Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak terms for the remainder 2 years of the Conservative Party. The UK's GDP contracted a further 0.2%, and inflation went up by 4.7%. The only good thing is the disposable income climbed to £3,050. Unemployment and poverty barely changed. See, in the 20th century, power came from bombs, banks, and ballots. In the 21st century, it comes from algorithms, networks, and infrastructure. And while the West argues about the past, China is designing the next era on its own terms. 3 decades ago, Chinese socialism was seen rather as a relic. Today, it is not only surviving, it is outpacing, outbuilding, and outthinking the Western capitalist model it was once told to imitate. In the span of 3 decades, China went from factory of the world to architect of a new world order. It fused the market with the mandate, innovation with ideology. While the West clung to its myths, China rewrote the game. As of 2025 and beyond, the global ideological contest has evolved beyond the traditional East versus West binary into a deeper confrontation of system versus system, where models of governance, economic organization, and civilizational identity compete for legitimacy and influence. This shift reflects the rise of multipolarity. China defines state-led capitalism with strategic authoritarianism, while liberal democracies in the West grapple with internal polarization and declining institutional trust. Simultaneously, emerging powers in the global South, like India, Brazil, and South Africa, are asserting hybrid models that blend market reform freedoms with state intervention and cultural nationalism. The new contest isn't merely geographic, it's structural. It's about whether top-down efficiency or decentralized democracy, strategic statecraft, or market spontaneity and cultural cohesion or pluralistic diversity can best deliver prosperity, security, and global influence in an era defined by climate pressure, digital power, and economic fragmentation. This ideological reconfiguration means every nation now faces an internal and external question. Which system works best and for whom? Will democracies still deliver stability? They could, but not automatically, of course. Their strength lies in adaptability, legitimacy through consent, and peaceful power transitions. When institutions are strong, rule of law is upheld, and citizens feel represented, democracies create stable environments for growth and innovation. However, in times of economic stress, polarization, or elite capture, democracies can become fragile, slow-moving, or even dysfunctional. The key challenge is balancing openness with cohesion, ensuring inclusion without paralysis. In the 21st century, democratic stability depends less on elections alone and more on institutional resilience, civic trust, and the ability to govern effectively amid complexity. Democracies that reform to meet citizens' needs on housing, security, climate, and inequality can remain both stable and legitimate. Those that don't risk democratic fatigue, unrest, or authoritarian drift. It begs another question. Can autocracies evolve into strict governments and continue to grow without collapsing? Indeed they can, but only under specific conditions. To ensure transition or adaptation without imploding, there must be maintenance to a delicate balance between centralized control and institutional innovation. Successful examples like China and Singapore have shown that with strategic governance, elite consensus, and phased reform, nations can modernize economically and even improve state capacity without triggering systemic collapse. However, the risk lies in rigid power structures, lack of accountability, and suppressed dissent, which can lead to brittle systems, vulnerable shocks, economic downturns, leadership crisis, or public unrest. The key to peaceful evolution is controlled pluralism, gradually expanding transparency, economic flexibility, and legal predictability while retaining enough authority to manage transition. Most autocracies fail here, but those that institutionalize succession, adapt policy pragmatically, and respond to citizens' needs can evolve without falling apart. The danger sometimes isn't autocracy itself, it's stagnation. Headed into the future, both China and the West are confronting deep internal crises that challenge their long-term stability and global influence. China faces a rapidly aging population, declining birth rates, and a shrinking workforce, undermining its economic momentum. It also struggles with local government debt, youth unemployment, and the over-reliance on state-driven investment. Meanwhile, Western nations, particularly in the United States and parts of Europe, are grappling with polarized societies, high sovereign debt, rising populism, and cost of living pressures exacerbated by climate-linked disruptions. This convergence of demographic, financial, environmental, and political strain reveals that no system is immune, and both models must now reinvent their domestic compacts to remain viable in a more turbulent global era. Neither the West's liberal democratic capitalism nor China's state-led authoritarian model is perfect. Each faces deep systemic flaws. The West struggles with institutional gridlock, inequality, and political fragmentation, while China battles with the already mentioned demographic decline and mounting debt. However, China currently holds more momentum, not because the system is flawless, but because it has executed long-term strategic planning with fewer political disruptions. Its ability to mobilize resources swiftly, invest in infrastructure, dominate critical supply chains, and drive industrial policy, particularly in artificial intelligence, green tech, and global trade, gives it a forward edge in key sectors. The West still leads in innovation, human rights, and soft power, but it is often reactive rather than proactive. In this phase of global realignment, China's system has gained operational momentum, even as its long-term sustainability remains uncertain. The US and UK built empires through capital, conquest, and control of narrative. China is building influence through infrastructure, code, and consistency. One bet on freedom with volatility, the other on order with vision. So what comes next? A world split between techno-democracy and algorithmic socialism, or something hybrid, something new? This isn't just about China or the West, it's about the future we are all complicit in building. One pandemic, one algorithm, one crisis at a time. Chinese socialism didn't win because it was perfect. It won because Western capitalism got comfortable, chaotic, and self-congratulatory. And while they argued in boardrooms and parliaments, China built. The race isn't over, but the rules have changed. And China, once dismissed, now leads not from behind, but from ahead.